sand listeners, Mojave River, 6,000 years after the collapse. From the history of the kingdom of Kushlevin, Guerrero. They heard the camels long before the caravan arrived. After the envoys had washed and eaten, and the gifts were arranged, old Sesqua came out of her wickiup and met the envoys in the shade of the cottonwoods. The envoys were dressed in short sarongs, dyed a deep turquoise blue, wore finely woven sandals, and both had thin light capes tied around their necks. Neither were strangers to diplomacy, and through a series of two interpreters, greeted Sesqua and her people, and presented their gifts. There were bundles of dried dates, as well as bundles of many other dried fruits, all exotic and from the deep lands of Mexico. There were rolls of fine cotton cloth in many colors. There were copper axes and knives. There were wheels and axles that could be assembled into small carts. When all of the gifts had been presented, the envoys explained the purpose of their mission and the questions of their lord. They moved knotted strings through their hands and read from a long belt woven of dyed quills and tiny shells. They told how they had traveled by boat northward for many days to arrive at the port at 1,000 palms. They told how they had traveled northward through the mountains and the desert to finally reach the home of the sand listeners on the Mojave River, and how they hoped that their request would be granted. Old Sesqua pondered their questions for a long time, and no one spoke. Finally, she agreed to go on a listening, but warned the envoys that no one knew if and when the sands would speak, and made arrangements to travel to the dunes the next morning. The dunes had been moving nearer to them every year, but they were still 2 days' journey away. Sesqua took 3 apprentices, and they set out just after dawn on foot. The first night they camped at the last springs on the edge of the Devil's Playground and refilled their goat skins. There were other great dunes to the north of them, but these dunes never sang, and they called them the quiet ones. When they reached the sand, the girls made a camp at the foot of the highest and steepest ridge of dunes. They had carried some dried food, but while they were at the dunes, they ate only the sand food, pulling up the tubers and eating them raw. On the 3rd day, the dunes began to sing. The deep voice of the patriarch boomed and moaned like a bullfrog might, if a bullfrog were 1,000 feet high. But there were other voices. The wife sang entreaties and sang of great loss. The wife sang tears and panther songs. She sang the orange of the dawn. And there was a third voice, a voice the listeners had never heard before. It was a young voice, an icy voice that creaked and punctuated the sand from everywhere at once. It sang of snow and of 10,000 miles of glistening crystals. It sang of rain and of animals that died too young. It sang of time longer than any of them knew. The women climbed the dunes following the ridges, and the sun was high before they reached the top. They had let Sesqua lead, and the girls were spread out behind her, but they all saw her suddenly sink into the sand like a rock into a pool. Deep beneath the sand, Sesqua visited the lord of the envoys in his distant palace. She saw the armies that had formed to the east and the south of him, and she saw him cutting the skin of his arms and his breast and his penis, and she knew that none of it would help. The singing of the sand had now formed into words. The patriarch and the wife greeted her and told stories, and she saw great elephants in snow, and she knew that the child was trying to give birth, but that one of them, either the mother or the child, would die. She saw the springs of her people where the bighorns came down to drink, and she saw the screw bean and the desert willow. She saw the Mojave River twisting across the desert like a sidewinder, rising up from the sand and then disappearing again into the sand. She saw a great soda lake fill and then dry, and then there were large metal insects made of iron and steel crawling on the ground and belching blue smoke. And then there were soldiers in blue coats, and then the lake again filled, and she wondered if she were back in her own time.